There is a fear that many people carry quietly into the later years of life, a fear that does not have a clean name and is not discussed at dinner tables or mentioned in passing conversations. It is not the fear of dying. Most people have made some kind of peace with that, eventually. This fear is different, and in some ways stranger, because it is the fear of living too long. Not living too long in any poetic or philosophical sense. Too long in a very specific, practical way. Too long for the money to last. There is something uncomfortable about even saying that out loud, because the culture has decided that a long life is an unambiguous victory. We celebrate 90th birthdays. We admire people who remain active into their 80s. Longevity is treated as an achievement, a reward for doing things right, for eating well and avoiding bad habits and staying curious about the world. And yet, quietly and persistently, millions of people in their 60s and 70s are sitting with a calculation that does not feel like a celebration. They are looking at their savings, looking at their age, and doing the arithmetic of how many years remain and whether the numbers will match. The fear is often not spoken directly. It shows up as a particular kind of hesitation before spending. It shows up in conversations about whether to fix the roof now or wait another year. It shows up in the quiet anxiety that follows a market decline, an anxiety that is different in quality from the worry a younger person feels, because a younger person has time to recover. A person at 70 does not have time in the same way. The runway is shorter, the margin for error smaller. For most of human history, the fear people carried about money and age ran in the opposite direction. The worry was dying before getting old enough to rest, before seeing the children grown, before finishing the work that mattered. People were worn out by physical labor long before they ran out of years. The idea of living so long that your savings gave out was simply not the problem most people faced. They did not live that long. Not in large numbers. Not the way people do now. Something changed over the course of the 20th century that altered this equation completely. Life expectancy extended dramatically, and it kept extending, decade by decade, as medicine improved and nutrition improved and the kinds of work people did became less physically destructive. People began living into their 80s and 90s in numbers that no previous generation had experienced. A person born in 1950 who retired in 2015 and is still alive today may well live another 10 or 15 years. That is a long retirement. That is 30 years, perhaps more, of drawing on savings that were built during 40 years of work. The retirement system was designed for a different world. It was designed when most people died within a few years of stopping work, when the gap between retirement and death was measured in months or a handful of years, not in decades. The system was never rebuilt when that changed. And so millions of people today are navigating a financial reality that the institutions around them were never designed to support. This is what this video is about. Not the fear itself, which cannot be resolved by a YouTube essay, but the structure underneath it. Why the fear is rational, where it came from, how the math actually works, and what it costs beyond money. Because longevity costs more than most people understand until they are living through it. We will look at how retirement was designed, and how life expectancy quietly outpaced it. We will look at how savings actually behave over a 25-year retirement, the slow drain, the healthcare costs that accumulate, the long-term care costs that no one budgets for because the numbers are too large to believe. And we will spend some time on the question underneath all of this. What does money actually mean when you are old, and what is lost when it runs out? None of this is meant to frighten. Understanding something clearly, even something difficult, is almost always better than being surprised by it. And a lot of people are being surprised by this. They are being surprised by how expensive being old turns out to be, and by how long old age lasts. This video is an attempt to reduce that surprise, and to say quietly but plainly, if you feel this fear, it is not because you did something wrong. To understand why so many people in their 60s and 70s are doing that quiet arithmetic about how long their money will last, you have to go back to the moment when retirement, as we know it, was invented. It was invented in 1935. The United States was in the middle of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law, and for the first time in American history, there was a federal program designed to provide income to older workers who could no longer work. The retirement age was set at 65. Here is what matters about that number. In 1935, average life expectancy in the United States was roughly 61 years. The retirement age was set higher than most people were expected to live. Social Security was not designed as a program that most people would collect for very long. It was designed as a floor, a safety net for the minority of workers who survived long enough to reach old age and could no longer earn. It was never designed to be a primary source of income for decades of post-work life. That is not a criticism of the people who designed it. It was a reasonable response to the world that existed at the time. But the world changed. By the 1960s, life expectancy in the United States had climbed past 70. By the 1990s, it had passed 75. By the early 2000s, a person who reached 65 could expect to live, on average, another 18 or 19 years. Today, many people who retire at 65 will live into their mid-80s or beyond. A significant portion will live into their 90s. A small but growing number will reach 100. The retirement age was adjusted incrementally over the decades. Social Security's full retirement age eventually moved to 67 for those born after 1960, but the fundamental architecture stayed the same. Meanwhile, the gap between when people stopped working and when they died grew from a few years into 2 decades or more. The pension system followed a similar logic. For much of the 20th century, working people in larger companies and public institutions were covered by defined benefit pension plans. These plans promised a fixed monthly payment for life after retirement, calculated based on years of service and final salary. The employer bore the responsibility of funding that promise. If you lived longer than average, the company paid for the extra years. If you lived to 87, the pension paid until 87. That was the arrangement, and for several decades, it largely held. The arrangement also assumed that most people would not live too long past retirement. The actuarial tables that pension plans were built on reflected the shorter lifespans of earlier decades. As life expectancy extended, the cost of these promises grew. Companies found themselves funding obligations that had become much more expensive than originally calculated. Pension funds that had seemed adequately capitalized began to show shortfalls. Beginning in the 1980s, and accelerating through the 1990s and into the 2000s, corporations began replacing defined benefit pensions with defined contribution plans. The most common of these was the 401k, which had been created by a clause in the Internal Revenue Code in 1978, originally as a way for highly compensated employees to defer income tax on a portion of their salary. It was not designed to be a complete retirement system. It was an addendum to an existing system that included pensions and Social Security. But as corporations saw an opportunity to reduce their long-term financial obligations, the 401k became the primary retirement vehicle for most private sector workers. The pension largely disappeared from the corporate world over the course of 2 decades. Public sector and union jobs often retained pension coverage, but for the broad working population, the shift was significant and swift. The difference between these two systems is not merely technical. It is a fundamental transfer of risk. Under a pension, the institution carries the longevity risk. The employee retires, collects their monthly payment, and the company manages whatever years remain. Under a 401k, the employee carries everything. They decide how much to contribute. They decide how to invest. They accumulate a lump sum, and then at retirement they must manage that lump sum without knowing how long they will need it to last, without knowing whether the market will cooperate, without the pooling of risk across thousands of other employees that made pensions financially stable. What makes this especially difficult is that managing longevity risk is genuinely one of the harder problems in personal finance. It requires estimating how long you will live, projecting healthcare costs over multiple decades, accounting for inflation across 20 or 30 years, and making investment decisions under uncertainty that professional fund managers with extensive resources and experience routinely get wrong. This problem was handed to ordinary workers with a paycheck deduction and a brochure. The math was always going to be challenging. And for a generation now living the consequences of that shift, the challenge is not theoretical. There is a concept in retirement planning sometimes called the 3 phases of retirement spending. It is not a cheerful concept, but it is an honest one, and it describes the financial arc that most people's retirement years follow more accurately than the smooth, stable income stream that projections tend to show. The first phase covers the early years, typically from retirement through the mid-70s. These are often the most active years of retirement, the ones people imagine during their working lives. Travel, grandchildren, projects that were deferred for decades, hobbies that finally have time, dinners out, a significant trip that had always been the plan. Spending in this phase can be higher than people expect, sometimes higher than it was during working years, because the time is finally available to spend what was saved, and the health is still there to enjoy it. The second phase is quieter. The pace slows. Travel becomes less frequent or less ambitious. Some activities become physically harder. Healthcare costs begin to rise, not dramatically at first, but steadily, and in ways that compound year over year. Medications become more numerous. Doctor visits more regular. The occasional procedure or hospitalization adds costs that insurance covers partly but not completely, arriving as surprise bills that were not in any plan. The third phase is the one that can break the financial plan entirely. It is the phase most people prefer not to dwell on when they are doing retirement calculations in their 50s or early 60s. It is the phase of serious care needs, assisted living facilities, nursing homes, home health aides who come for hours each day or through the night. The phase when a person can no longer manage basic daily activities independently and requires structured, professional help to continue living. The cost of that help is staggering in a way that is difficult to convey without sounding alarmist. A private room in a nursing home in the United States currently costs somewhere in the range of $90,000 to over $100,000 per year. Assisted living facilities typically run $50,000 to $60,000 annually, and often more in major metropolitan areas. Home health aides, which allow a person to remain in their own home with care support, cost roughly $25 to $30 per hour, and if someone requires significant daily assistance, the annual cost can rival or exceed a nursing home. These costs do not last for a month or two. The average stay in a nursing home is over 2 years, but many residents stay considerably longer. 5 years is not unusual. 7 is not unheard of. And when you multiply those annual costs across that time, the arithmetic becomes devastating. A person who spent a working lifetime carefully building $300,000 in retirement savings can find that some consumed entirely within 3 or 4 years of entering full care. The savings that were meant to provide security for 20 years are gone in a fraction of that time. Medicare, which most people entering retirement rely on as their primary healthcare safety net, does not cover long-term custodial care. This is one of the most consequential and least understood features of the American healthcare system for older adults. Medicare covers limited stays in skilled nursing facilities following a hospitalization, under specific conditions, for a limited number of days. After those days, the coverage ends. The ongoing cost of a nursing home or an assisted living facility falls to the individual or to Medicaid, the government program for people who have exhausted most of their assets and income. The path to Medicaid eligibility requires a person to have spent down their savings to very low levels. The specific rules vary by state and involve significant complexity. But the general reality is that to receive government coverage for long-term care, a person must first have lost most of what they saved. The gap between what people expect Medicare to cover and what it actually covers represents one of the great financial surprises of later life. People spend their working years watching the Medicare deduction on each paycheck, and they arrive at retirement with a reasonable expectation that health care has been taken care of. Then they discover the monthly premiums, The annual deductibles, the copayments for every visit, the medications that are partially covered but not fully, the dental work that is not covered, the hearing aids that are not covered, and the long-term care that is not covered. Beyond the numbers, there is the emotional weight of watching savings decline. There is something particular about the experience of drawing down an account that took decades to build. During the working years, the motion of money was in one direction. You built the number up, slowly, over time, and each contribution felt like progress. In retirement, the direction reverses. Every month, the balance falls. For some people this is manageable and expected. For others it produces a persistent, low-level anxiety that is difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. People who live through this describe a particular kind of vigilance, a hesitation before spending, a mental calculation about whether a given expense is truly necessary, a quiet monitoring of the account that does not fully switch off. Not because they are incapable of enjoying the money they saved, but because the number is finite and they do not know how long they need it to last, and because they have watched what happened to people in their 80s who did not plan carefully enough, or whose plans were overtaken by costs they could not have foreseen. They are not bad at money. They are doing reasonable arithmetic in an unreasonable situation. There is a reason people find it so difficult to plan seriously for very old age. It is not laziness. It is not simple denial, though denial plays a role. The deeper reason is something that psychologists describe as present bias combined with what might be called psychological distance. The difficulty of making decisions today that protect a version of yourself that feels genuinely foreign. When a 30-year-old tries to imagine being 65, there is a gap, but the person at 65 is still recognizable. They are independent. They are competent. They are making choices about how to spend their time. Most people at 30 can project toward that version of themselves with some sense of continuity, a future that is distant but not alien. When a 65-year-old tries to imagine being 85, the gap is different in kind. The person at 85 may not be mobile in the same way, may not be cognitively sharp on the same terms, may not be making all of their own decisions, may be living somewhere that does not feel like home, may be dependent on people they do not know for help with things that have always been private. That version of the self feels less like a future and more like a stranger, someone abstract, someone difficult to look at directly, someone easier to defer thinking about until later. And so people defer. They plan for retirement in its early, active, recognizable form, the years that look like freedom, like a reward. They do not plan in equal detail for the years when that freedom has narrowed, because sitting with that image long enough to plan for it carefully is uncomfortable in a way that most people instinctively avoid. This is not a moral failure. It is a feature of how human psychology is built. We respond to the immediate and visible. We discount the distant and abstract. The self we will inhabit at 87 is not more real to us than a neighbor we have never met. Protecting that future self financially requires a kind of imaginative empathy that our minds are not naturally equipped to sustain. But the cost of that difficulty is paid eventually. And what it costs is not only money. What money buys in old age is different from what money buys when you are younger. Younger, money buys experience and comfort and opportunity. It buys travel and good meals and the ability to give your children things that make their lives easier. In old age, money buys something more fundamental. It buys independence. It buys choice. It buys the ability to decide where you live, who is around you, who helps you when you need help, what kind of care you receive, and whether you are able to remain in a place that feels like your own. Money buys the ability to say no. No to a facility that feels wrong. No to a care arrangement that does not feel dignified. No to a situation where your preferences are overridden because you cannot afford anything better. When money runs out, those abilities narrow. The options that cost more disappear. The decisions that were once yours to make become decisions made by others. By family members doing their best in a difficult situation, by institutions following their own protocols, by whatever the system will offer when you arrive at its door without resources of your own. This is what people mean when they talk about independence in the context of aging. Not independence in the sense of needing no one. All human beings need other people, at every age, and dependency in various forms is part of the human condition at every stage. But independence in the sense of retaining some meaningful agency over the texture of your own life. Some ability to choose where you are and who is with you and how you are treated. Some continued sense that your preferences matter, that you are not simply a problem to be managed efficiently, but a person with a history and wishes and a specific understanding of what makes life feel worth living. That kind of independence is expensive in the modern world, not as a luxury, but as a baseline. And the quiet fear that many people carry in their late 60s and early 70s is not really about the account balance. It is about what the account balance represents. The remaining years of relative choice, the continued possibility of shaping their own days, the protection against a narrowing that feels like a kind of disappearance. Longevity revealed something about the retirement system that the system was never designed to address. Not just that people would need more money to live longer, though they do, obviously, but that they would need that money to protect things that are harder to name than a monthly expense: dignity, agency, the ability to be treated as a person rather than a patient. The financial conversation about retirement tends to focus on income and returns and withdrawal rates. Those things matter, but underneath them is a quieter question. What are we actually trying to protect? What is the money for, when you get down to it? The answer is not comfort in any abstract sense. It is the ability to keep being yourself, in some recognizable way, for as long as that is possible. Money, when it works, buys that. And when it does not work, when the savings run out before the years do, what is lost is not merely purchasing power. It is a particular kind of freedom that, once gone, is very difficult to recover. There is a particular way this situation tends to feel personal, and it deserves to be addressed directly. When someone runs out of money in their mid-80s, when the savings are spent and the options have narrowed and decisions are being made by others, the experience is often shadowed by a feeling of having failed somehow. A sense that if they had saved more, spent less freely, made different choices somewhere along the way, things would be different. The culture reinforces this. Financial self-help is built around the premise that individual decisions are the primary variable. Plan better, save more, invest smarter. The implication is that the people who struggle are the ones who did not plan well enough. Sometimes that is partly true. Decisions matter, and some decisions are better than others. But the scale of the mismatch between how long people now live and how the retirement system was designed is not a problem that individual planning was ever going to fully solve. A person who saved consistently for 40 years, followed every reasonable guideline they were given, made sound investment choices, and still finds their savings exhausted at 88 has not failed. They have lived longer than the plan they were sold was designed to cover. They have encountered the structural gap at the center of the modern retirement system, the gap between a system built for shorter lives and the longer lives that arrived. Understanding this as a structural problem does not eliminate the difficulty. The gap remains whether we understand it or not. The costs are real, and the worry about meeting them is rational. But understanding the structure does change something about how a person carries the worry. It removes some of the shame from the equation. It makes the fear something that can be looked at directly, named, discussed, and planned around, rather than something that must be hidden because it seems to reflect badly on the person feeling it. For people who are still in the years when preparation is possible, what honest preparation looks like is not always what financial advertising suggests. It does not mean guaranteeing a secure outcome, because guarantees of that kind are not available for a problem this complex. It means understanding the phases of retirement spending honestly, that the later years carry higher costs, not lower ones. It means looking clearly at what Medicare covers and what it does not, rather than discovering those limits at the moment they become urgent. It means having some realistic sense of what long-term care costs, even if the number is uncomfortable to look at. And it means, perhaps most practically, Having the conversations with family that most families avoid, about wishes and plans and preferences, about who will make decisions and under what circumstances, about what matters most when the choices begin to narrow. For people who are already deep into those years, living with the quiet arithmetic of finite savings against an uncertain future, the most honest thing to say is this: the worry you feel is a rational response to a real situation. It is not a symptom of having done something wrong. Many people who did everything right are sitting with the same calculation. The system they trusted to support them was built for a version of human life that no longer exists. That is not their fault. A long life, even an uncertain one, even a complicated and costly one, still contains the things that make it worth living. The relationships that accumulated over decades, the mornings that are still quiet, the small pleasures that do not require money, the understanding of the world that no account balance can diminish. What the money protects, when it works, is the space for those things to continue. And even when the money falls short, those things are not entirely gone. The fear of outliving your savings is real. The structural reasons for it are real. But so is the life that continues alongside that fear. And that life, complicated and uncertain as it is, still deserves to be understood clearly, carried honestly, and lived as fully as the years allow.